Have you experienced being tired all the time, having a blur vision, urinating more often than usual, having a slow progress in wound healing, and being thirsty all the time? Well, maybe you have type 2 diabetes. You just don't know it. Did you know that in year 2022, in the Philippines, there are more than 41,000 deaths due to diabetes mellitus? It is very alarming. Now, what happens to our body when we experience having type 2 diabetes? First, let's start in pancreas. In pancreas, the pancreas produces an insulin. Now, this insulin, when you have type 2 diabetes, what happens is that the insulin doesn't produce enough insulin. And you could also have insulin resistance. Let's say, for example, you intake a food, and that food will be turned into a glucose that will later on use for our energy. Now, the glucose will be absorbed into our cells, but it won't be absorbed without any help. The insulin will help the glucose to absorb into the cells. But since if you have type 2 diabetes, this glucose won't be absorbed into the cells because there's not enough insulin. So there's no energy for the cells to process. That is why you feel tired all the time. And also you will have high blood sugar level. Why? Because those glucose that aren't absorbed into the cells will be just streaming around into our bloodstreams. Why we have blur vision? Because diabetes ruins the blood vessels of the retina in our eyes. Now this retina help us to see more clearly. Then you may be asking, why we urinate more often? It is because our body response is to eliminate those excess sugar. That's why we urinate more often. Why we feel thirsty? Because our body wanted to dilute those sugars, those excess sugars in our body. That's why we feel thirsty all the time. Now remember, we have to understand that these signs and symptoms are very important. We shouldn't ignore this because it will lead to more complications. Now, what are the factors, or if you might be wondering, am I at risk of having type 2 diabetes mellitus? Well, here is the thing. First, the genetics is hereditary. Next is your insulin resistance. The third one is the most important and contribute largely to having a diabetes. It's all about lifestyle. Now, I'll explain to you the lifestyle. When you are more of a person that eats a lot of sugars, wants more carbohydrates, you will have glucose spikes more often. When you intake sugars, you'll have glucose spikes. But since that sugars, the carbohydrates is more complex form of sugar, of glucose. Now, for short, carbohydrates are just sugars. Now, the carbohydrates are easily digested, easily absorbed in our body. That's why when we have glucose spike, since it's easily absorbed or digested, it will drop immediately. Now, that drop will make you feel like you're craving more of sugars. You wanted to eat more sugars. Now, what might be your response if you can't control your body? More likely you will eat more sugars then. And this process will keep on repeating. Glucose spike and drop, eating more sugar, then glucose spike and down. Now, if you see this, this is very alarming. What will happen is that when our body is more of glucose, since that there's a lot of glucose, our body's response is to produce more insulin because they wanted that the glucose will be absorbed into our cell. But since there are a lot of insulin going on here, what will happen now is that our body is used to that insulin because there are a higher level of insulin now. What will happen is that you will have insulin resistance. And if you have insulin resistance, what will happen now is that our pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin. And what will happen? The glucose won't be absorbed properly into our cells. Now you have type 2 diabetes. So you see that these signs and symptoms are very important, and we shouldn't ignore this, because if it left untreated, what will happen? It could be lead to heart attacks, strokes, kidney failure, and worse, if you have a wound, it could be amputated. Because you have a slow wound healing process, it could be amputated. Next, signs and symptoms would be a blur vision. If it left untreated over the time, you will no longer see. As you can see, being aware of these signs and symptoms are very important, because early prevention is better than curing. So we have to more aware of our health and what we eat, because this will prevent us of having diabetes. Thank you so much.